Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Kim Brown in Baltimore. Levels of mistrust between police and communities of color, in particular African-American communities, are at very uncomfortable levels. Really, since the rise of smartphones and social media, the number of cases regarding unarmed black citizens gunned down by police with oftentimes little to no consequence, and the rise of such movements such as Black Lives Matter has pushed the issue of police brutality and police accountability to the forefront. Well, sort of. Both of the presidential candidates of the major parties have expressed positions encouraging the strengthening of police forces via either more funding or training or more powers, such as expanding police policies like stop and frisk. But can communities of color really expect understanding of this issue from either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump? Well, let's start the discussion by introducing our guest today. We're joined with John A. Powell, who is the director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society. And we're also speaking with Christina Heatherton. She is an assistant professor of American Studies at Trinity College. Thank you both for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Well, before we get into the discussion, let's hear from Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on this issue.
You know, I started off as a young lawyer working against discrimination against African-American children in schools and in the criminal justice system. I worked to make sure that kids with disabilities could get a public education, something that I care very much about. I have worked with Latinos. One of my first jobs in politics was down in South Texas, registering Latino citizens to be able to vote. So I have a deep devotion, to use your absolutely correct word, to making sure that every American feels like he or she has a place in our country.
I've heard them where Hillary's constantly talking about the inner cities of our country, which are a disaster, education-wise, job-wise, safety-wise, in every way possible. I'm going to help the African Americans. I'm going to help the Latinos, Hispanics. I am going to help the inner cities. She's done a terrible job for the African Americans. She wants their vote, and she does nothing, and then she comes back 4 years later.
Those clips were from the second presidential debate, which was held Sunday night at Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri. John, let's get started with you, because the issue sort of came up in the second debate, not really. We heard more from the candidates during the first debate, where Donald Trump doubled down on his calls for law and order. He called for a national policy of stop and frisk from police. On the Hillary Clinton side, she has expressed some understanding about systemic racism and implicit bias, but her solution seems to be more money and more training for police. Are either of these candidates on the right track for rectifying this very troubling and dire situation?
Well, a couple of things. The problem is actually huge. I mean, the police is one expression of it, but it's not just the police. It is really the police is doing the bidding of much of our society, in the sense of containing, controlling, and in some cases killing black and brown people on the streets. But in terms of that, I would say the comparison between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump couldn't be further apart. I mean, Donald Trump is actually advocating for more of the same. He's actually advocating for a police state. He's not really speaking to the black community. If you look at his campaign, it wasn't until very late that he even went to the black community. And so his talk about reaching out to the black community is largely for moderate white voters. But his hardcore constituents are really quite hostile to blacks, and certainly whenever there's an incident with the police, it's almost an inflexive support of the police. And his call for law and order is reference to Nixon's law and order campaign in the 1960s, which again was reaching out to white segregationists. So Trump is actually pretty hostile. And so when he talks about what are you going to do for the black community, and he's like, law and order, I'm going to get more police on the street and have stop and frisk, and then people must respect the law. And then he describes the black community in very disparaging terms. I mean, the black community is huge. Most black people don't even live in the city. But his notion of the black community is like a caricature. In terms of Hillary, I think, again, it's not a complete solution, but I think she's talking to people at least. She talked about implicit bias, which most Americans were not aware of, and maybe still are not aware of. It's a real thing. It actually affects all of us, but it's a deadly effect with the police. Training can help. It can't solve the problem, but we can begin to take steps. So while neither of them have a complete solution will take time because the problem is so deep. They're really radically different. And Trump is really, from my perspective, clearly hostile to the Black community and stoking Black hostility in the right-wing white community.
Christina, there have been some on the left, African Americans, millennials, those within the movement for Black Lives, who say that Hillary Clinton is basically saying the right things in order to court the African American vote. However, what she will actually do as president in regards to law enforcement and how she will direct her Department of Justice certainly remains to be seen. But her idea of providing more training for police, this notion of body cameras, it's an idea that many seem to feel is the elixir to solving the issues. That is, if only the police were trained better, if only they have the equipment to help them hold them accountable, then we won't have these issues. Do you think that's actually the case?
Well, thanks very much for the question. And before I begin, let me say Happy Indigenous Peoples Day. I think what's so interesting in this debate is not so much where the two candidates stand. And as you said before, Trump's positions are often so incoherent, it'd be disingenuous to say that they were actually coherent, solidified positions. I think what we need to be mindful of are the ways in which they define and delimit the conversation. So, for example, when the question is about racism, there's this huge deflection about inner cities for Trump. And similarly, when there's the question of policing, we see nothing but a set of deflections. Last night's debate was extraordinary in that it was set in St. Louis, and yet there wasn't a mumbling word about Ferguson. There wasn't a mumbling word about Mike Brown. There wasn't a word spoken about the outrage and unrest around this country, around police killings, around mass incarceration, around, things, the outrage that people in this country are feeling. Now, to your question, what we're dealing with right now is a flawed solution that comes from a flawed diagnosis. As Professor Powell said, the Clinton campaign has introduced the concept of implicit bias. But the solutions, as you mentioned, the solutions of, trying to diversify police forces, trying to offer sensitivity or diversity training for officers, this has not proven to succeed at any point in U.S. history. This does not reverse implicit bias. Racism in policing is not an individual set of assumptions or beliefs. It's systemic. It's a reflection of the material conditions. And if we're going to change racism in policing, we're going to have to change racism in this society, full stop.
Telling moments in this discussion as far as it relates to the 2016 election didn't happen in the presidential debate. It actually happened in the vice presidential debate where the Republican Mike Pence was debating with Democrat Tim Kaine about this very issue of implicit bias. And Mike Pence seemed to approach it with a level of incredulity. So let's take a look at that clip if we could.
At the risk of agreeing with you, community policing is a great idea. It's worked in the Hoosier State, and we fully support that. Donald Trump and I are going to make sure that law enforcement have the resources and the tools to be able to really restore law and order to the cities and communities of this nation. It's probably why the 330,000 members of the Fraternal Order Police endorsed Donald Trump as the next president of the United States of America, because they see his commitment to them. They see his commitment to law and order. But they also hear the bad-mouthing that comes from people that seize upon tragedy in the wake of police action shootings as a reason to use a broad brush to accuse law enforcement of implicit bias or institutional racism. And that really has got to stop.
African Americans and Latinos get sentenced for the same crimes at very different rates.
We need criminal justice reform. Indiana has passed criminal justice
But I just want to say, those who say we should not be able to bring up and talk about bias in the system will never solve the problem.
When an African American police officer is involved in a police action shooting involving an African American, why would Hillary Clinton accuse that African American police officer of implicit bias?
I guess I can't believe you are defending the position that there is no bias and it's a topic.
So, John, we need a little bit of professorial isms from you right now, because Mike Pence is echoing a sentiment that we hear from a lot of people who don't seem to understand that even if the police officer is African American involved in the shooting of an African American, that somehow implicit bias is not involved in that equation. Can you explain that for us?
Yes, it's hard when new concepts like implicit bias get introduced in something like a presidential election, because it's a complicated concept, but it's also real. It's empirically tested. One of the things, implicit bias does not mean the same as racism, although it has very serious implications. Implicit bias comes from society. It's automatic response to the environment based on being exposed to something in close proximity. So when we see things in close proximity, the example is Pavlov's dog. You hit the bell, you feed the dog. You hit the bell, you feed the dog. The dog actually, then you hit the bell, the dog starts salivating because they've drawn a connection between the bell and the dog. The bell and food, even though there's not one. So when we see things happen in close proximity frequently, the mind, the unconscious mind, draws a connection. And so in a sense, implicit bias is the mind reading the environment. So one of the things people understand is that implicit bias is social. It's actually reflecting the environment. It's actually structural. It's not an individual trait. And it's something that affects all of us. But it affects whites, tend to affect whites more because whites don't have common stereotypical examples. So if there's a bias, an association that blacks have guns, which there is in our society, which is not accurate, whites have more guns than black, white people will not have enough contact with blacks to actually reduce that bias. But even blacks will have that bias. Now, whether it exists or not, we can measure it. It's not a question of just an argument back and forth. Of social science, neuroscience can measure implicit bias. And implicit bias is actually something that exists in every society. The content of it, the strength of it, how it operates is socially specific. But we could not exist without implicit bias. But implicit bias is not everything. There's actually explicit bias too. There's still old-fashioned racism. There's structural racialization and structural racism. So we're talking about a complex concept. But implicit bias is an important concept for Americans to begin to understand. And unfortunately, it's being made into a political football.
Christina, there seems to be a range of acknowledgement about the need for criminal justice reform. As we heard just in that clip from Governor Mike Pence of Indiana, he claims that Indiana has undergone some sort of criminal justice reform. And we've heard this coming mostly from the left of this need for the reform in the justice system because of the racial biases for sentencing, for arrests, and for a myriad of things. But are we actually hearing real solutions about how to address criminal justice reform from either Republicans or Democrats?
In the early 90s, one of my favorite bands, SWV, had a song called Weak. And they had a line that said, I can't figure out just what to do when the cause and cure is you. I think this is a great metaphor for police reform in this country right now, where both the cause and the cure are the same, more policing. So when there are mass uprisings and when stop and frisks are ruled unconstitutional, the solution is, well, let's increase funding for policing. Now, the way this increased funding usually happens is with proposals for more reform, different kinds of policing, community policing, as we talked about before, programs to reduce implicit violence, programs like instituting body cameras. But what we show in the book Policing the Planet that I recently co-edited is that policing is the problem. We're in this very strange bind where we keep redoubling the problem. We keep funding the very thing that needs to be fixed without any thoughtful protocol about how things actually change. So, one important reframing that I think needs to happen in this election is, while extremists like Donald Trump are calling for law and order, how can we talk about increasing law and order when we don't even have basic rule of law?
That's Christina Heatherton. She is an assistant professor of American Studies at Trinity College, and bonus points for her for using the SWV reference. We've also been joined with John Powell. He is the director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society. Thank you both for joining us. I'm sure we're going to have you both on again in the future, because this issue is certainly ongoing.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you for watching the Real News Network.